My husband said, "I want a divorce. My mistress is carrying my child. You're too old." I simply smiled and signed every document. What I did next destroyed his life. Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to think a quiet life was a good life. Our house sat at the end of Maple Creek Drive in suburban Connecticut. A colonial with white shutters, a wraparound porch, and a garden I tended every Saturday morning with the kind of stubborn devotion that probably said more about me than I realized. Marcus and I had lived there for 19 years. We'd painted every room together, argued over tile samples, raised our daughter Lily through braces and heartbreaks and college applications. I believed, with the particular confidence of a woman who has built something slowly and carefully, that I knew what I had. I was a CPA with my own small practice, not glamorous but mine. 15 years of steady clients, a good reputation in town, a modest office on Birchwood Street with a ficus I'd managed not to kill. Marcus ran a mid-size commercial HVAC company, Crawford Climate Solutions, which had grown considerably over the years, in no small part because I had handled his books for the first decade, quietly restructuring his tax exposure and catching errors his accountants missed. He knew I was good. He just stopped noticing. That was the first warning sign, if I'm honest. Not a dramatic one, just the gradual sense of being furniture, of being something useful but unremarkable. He stopped asking about my clients, stopped sitting with me on the porch after dinner, started working late in a pattern so consistent it had its own rhythm, like a second heartbeat in the house that wasn't mine. I noticed the cologne first. He'd worn the same brand for 20 years, a woody cedar scent I associated with Sunday mornings and his shoulder under my cheek. Then one evening in February, he came home smelling like something sharper, sweeter, distinctly not his. I said nothing. I filed it. Then came the phone. He had always been careless with technology. I'd set up his email, his calendar, his business accounts for years. But suddenly the phone never left his hand. He took it to the bathroom. He angled the screen away when I walked past. Small things. The kind of things you can explain away if you want to badly enough. I didn't want to badly enough. I started paying closer attention to what I already had access to. Not snooping. I was still telling myself that. Just noticing. I managed our household accounts. I noticed cash withdrawals that didn't correspond to anything I could identify. $300 here, $500 there. Weekend supplier meetings that left no business receipts. A hotel charge in New Haven that appeared on a card I'd almost forgotten existed. I told myself I was probably wrong. I made dinner. I smiled at breakfast. I slept 6 inches away from a man who had become a stranger, and I lay awake in the dark, very still, listening to him breathe. It was a Wednesday in March when everything changed. I came home early from the office. A client had canceled, and Marcus's car was in the driveway at 2 in the afternoon. Unusual. I went inside quietly, not thinking anything specific, just noting the strangeness. He was in the kitchen on the phone, his back to me, his voice low and warm in a register I hadn't heard directed at me in years. I know. Just be patient. She won't be a problem. I'll handle it." He turned and saw me. The warmth drained from his face instantly, replaced by something I can only describe as calculation. He ended the call. He said it was a contractor. I said, of course. We made dinner and ate in near silence, and I did not cry, not even later when I was alone. I was already starting to think. 3 weeks after that, Marcus sat across from me at our kitchen table, the same table where we'd celebrated Lily's college acceptance, where I'd helped him sign his first major contract, and he told me he was leaving. "I want a divorce," he said. He didn't look ashamed. "Kayla is pregnant. I'm going to be a father again." He paused, and then, as if he'd been practicing this, as if it were the line he'd saved for last, he said, "You're too old for this kind of life, Diane. You've been coasting for years." I looked at him across the table. I thought about 19 years. I thought about the garden and the porch and the ficus on Birchwood Street and every tax return I'd ever filed for Crawford Climate Solutions. And I smiled, not a kind smile, a quiet one. The kind that comes not from happiness, but from the sudden, clarifying certainty that you know exactly where you are and exactly what you're going to do. "Okay," I said, and I signed every document he put in front of me. He looked almost disappointed. He had expected tears, I think. Begging, maybe. He had not expected stillness. He didn't know that stillness was where I did my best work. The night Marcus left to stay at Kayla's apartment, he didn't tell me that's where he was going, but I knew. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold, and I let myself feel it. All of it. The humiliation, the loneliness that had apparently been building for years without my full acknowledgement. The specific, particular sting of "you're too old," which was meant to diminish me and had instead landed like a key turning in a lock. I gave myself that one night. I cried privately, in the way I do most things, efficiently and without an audience. And then I opened my laptop. Here is something Marcus had never fully appreciated in 19 years of marriage. I am an accountant. A very good one. I understand numbers the way some people understand faces, instinctively, completely, with an immediate sense of what's off. And because Marcus had always found financial paperwork tedious, and because I had always been willing to manage it, I had spent nearly 2 decades with access to every account, every filing, every incorporation document connected to our life together. I started with what I knew. Our marital assets were substantial. The house on Maple Creek Drive was worth roughly $940,000. We'd checked an appraisal the previous year for refinancing purposes. We had joint investment accounts totaling approximately $310,000. There was a retirement account in Marcus's name alone, but Connecticut is an equitable distribution state, which means marital assets are divided fairly regardless of whose name they're in. I knew this. I'd known it for years. I just never had cause to treat it as relevant. But here's where it became interesting. Crawford Climate Solutions was incorporated in 2009. I had helped Marcus set up the original LLC structure. I remembered the paperwork, the conversations, the specific afternoon we'd signed documents at our dining room table because we couldn't afford an office yet. At the time, to protect the business from personal liability, we had structured it with 2 members, Marcus Crawford and Diane Crawford, 51% and 49% respectively. Marcus, I was now quite certain, had forgotten this. I pulled up the original operating agreement from our file cabinet. I keep paper copies of everything, a habit Marcus always mocked as paranoid, and sat with it for a long time. It was still valid. It had never been amended. There had been a period around 2015 when Marcus had talked about buying me out, restructuring, bringing in a business partner. That conversation had dissolved, as many of our conversations did in those years, into the background noise of ordinary life. Nothing had been filed. Nothing had changed. I owned 49% of Crawford Climate Solutions. The company that, according to the most recent tax returns I'd helped prepare, had gross revenues of approximately $4.2 million annually. I made a list, not an emotional list, not things he took from me, but a factual, precise, numbered inventory of every asset, every account, every holding that could be considered marital property under Connecticut law. I wrote down the house, the investments, the retirement accounts, the business. I estimated values conservatively, the way I would for a client, erring on the side of caution. Then I wrote another list, what I would need. A very good divorce attorney, someone who specialized in high-asset cases and business valuation, a forensic accountant to review Crawford's books for the last 5 years, because I had a nagging sense, based on those unexplained cash withdrawals, that Marcus had been moving money in ways that wouldn't survive scrutiny. And time. Quiet, patient, unhurried time, which is something a man who underestimates you tends to give you in abundance. The fear was still there. I want to be honest about that. I was 51 years old, facing the end of a marriage that had defined my adult life, with a man who had already positioned me as someone past her useful years. The fear was real, about money, about loneliness, about who I would be without the structure of us. But underneath the fear was something steadier, something I recognized from the long nights of building my practice, from the early years when Marcus's business nearly failed and I had reworked his financials at the kitchen table until 3 a.m, a kind of cold, quiet competence. I called my daughter Lily in Boston the following morning. I didn't tell her everything. She was in the middle of her own life, a demanding job, a relationship she was navigating carefully. I told her simply that her father and I were separating, that I was handling it, and that I loved her. She asked if I was okay. I said I would be, and I meant it in a way that surprised even me. Then I called Patricia Howe. Patricia was the best divorce attorney in Hartford County. I knew this not from personal need, but from professional circles. I had worked with her on the financial side of 2 client cases. She was 63, methodical, and had a reputation for what colleagues politely called creative thoroughness. She was not cheap. She was worth every dollar. I made the appointment for the following Thursday. I did not tell Marcus. He was, I assumed, celebrating. Let him celebrate. I had 19 years of documentation and a filing cabinet that remembered everything he'd chosen to forget. Patricia Howe's office was on the 14th floor of a glass building in downtown Hartford, with a view of the Connecticut River and the quiet, organized authority of a woman who had spent 3 decades ensuring that other people's disasters were handled precisely. I liked her immediately. She had reading glasses on a chain and a yellow legal pad, and she listened to me for 40 minutes without interrupting. When I finished, she put her pen down. You have 49% of a $4 million revenue LLC, she said. Correct. And he hasn't amended the operating agreement. I checked 3 times. Nothing was ever filed. She wrote something on her pad. And you prepared his tax returns? For the first 10 years. The last 5 he used a firm in Stamford, but I still had informal access to his business accounts through our shared financial software until about 8 months ago, when he changed the passwords. Patricia looked up. 8 months ago. Yes. We looked at each other. 8 months ago aligned closely with what I suspected was the beginning of his relationship with Kayla, or at least the point at which he'd begun to prepare, consciously or not, for a future that didn't include me. I want a forensic accountant on the business financials immediately, she said, and I want you to write down everything you can remember about those cash withdrawals, dates, approximate amounts, patterns. She paused. Diane, Has he been served with anything yet? No. He put his own divorce petition together through an online service. It's very basic. He listed the house and the joint investment accounts as marital assets. He did not list the business. Patricia's expression didn't change, but something sharpened behind her eyes. Of course he didn't. She filed our response within the week, a counter-petition that was, as she put it, comprehensive. It listed every asset I had documented, including my 49% interest in Crawford Climate Solutions, and formally requested a full business valuation. It also requested full financial disclosure from Marcus for the preceding 5 years. I know the exact moment he received it because he called me. It was a Friday evening. I was at my office finishing a client file, the ficus in the corner catching the last of the afternoon light. My phone rang and I saw his name and I answered calmly. "What the hell is this?" His voice was different, stripped of the careful, managed tone he'd been using since he left. This was something older and rawer. "You have a lawyer? You're claiming the business?" "I'm claiming my legal interest in the business," I said, "which I've held since 2009. That was a formality. You were never involved in running Crawford." "I was involved in structuring it, financing it, and preparing its tax returns for a decade. The operating agreement reflects that. My attorney has a copy." Silence. Then, "Diane." "Have your attorney call Patricia Howe," I said. "She's expecting it." I hung up. My hands were perfectly steady. I noticed that, with some interest, the way you notice an unexpected detail. "Oh, so that's how I am under pressure. Good to know." What happened over the following 2 weeks told me everything I needed to understand about how badly I had rattled him. Marcus called twice more. I referred him to Patricia each time. His lawyer, a man named Gerald Finch, who I later learned had been recommended by Kayla's father, sent a letter disputing my interest in Crawford on the grounds that I had never functioned as an active member. Patricia responded with the operating agreement, the original LLC filing, and a list of my documented financial contributions to the business in its early years. The letter that came back was noticeably less confident. Then the forensic accountant, a quiet man named Robert Chen, who Patricia used regularly, got into Crawford's books. He called me on a Tuesday afternoon. "Mrs. Crawford." He had the deliberate, measured tone of someone who has learned to deliver complicated information without inflection. "I've completed my preliminary review. There are some significant irregularities." Significant irregularities. In accounting, that phrase does a great deal of work. What Robert had found, over the preceding 4 years, Marcus had been routing money from Crawford through a separate LLC, a shell company called MCG Consulting, registered in Delaware, in the form of consulting fees. The payments were structured just below the threshold that would trigger automatic audit flags. They totaled, across 4 years, approximately $340,000. MCG Consulting had one registered agent. The name was unfamiliar to me, but Robert had done the extra step of cross-referencing with property records. The registered agent's address was the same as Kayla Merritt's apartment in New Haven. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment, looking at the Connecticut River through my office window, broad and indifferent in the afternoon light. He had been building her a fund, quietly, systematically, using money from a company I co-owned for at least 4 years. The pregnancy was recent. The planning was not. "Robert," I said, "I need that in a full written report with documentation." "It'll be ready by Friday," he said. I thanked him and ended the call and sat very still in my office until the sun went down. The report from Robert Chen was 61 pages, Patricia read it over a weekend and called me Monday morning with the particular quiet energy of someone who has found exactly what she was looking for. "We file a fraudulent conveyance claim," she said without preamble. "The transfers to MCG were made with the intent to hide marital assets from equitable distribution. That's not just relevant to the divorce. That's a separate civil action, and depending on how the DA's office reads it, there may be criminal exposure for tax fraud." "I'm not interested in criminal charges," I said immediately. I'd thought about this. I want what's mine. I don't want to destroy him. I want to be finished with him. Understood. But the existence of criminal exposure is leverage. It changes the negotiating landscape considerably. She was right, of course. Within days of filing the fraudulent conveyance claim, Gerald Finch's tone shifted from combative to something closer to strained diplomacy. Marcus, I gathered, was having a difficult week. And then Kayla called me. I didn't know she had my number. I assume Marcus gave it to her, or she found it, or perhaps she'd had it for longer than I wanted to think about. The call came on a Thursday evening while I was making dinner, a simple pasta, the kitchen warm with garlic and olive oil, an ordinary domestic scene that felt almost absurd given the circumstances. Her voice was younger than I expected. She was 29, I knew that, but there was something additionally young in the quality of her uncertainty. She'd been expecting, I think, to reach someone diminished. "I think we should talk," she said, "woman to woman." "All right," I said. I turned down the stove. She told me I was making things difficult, that Marcus and she had a child coming and they needed stability, that I was being vindictive, holding on to a business I'd never really been part of, that dragging this through court would hurt everyone, including Lily. "Lily is an adult," I said. "She'll manage." "Marcus says you were never really invested in that company." "Marcus can submit that position to the court with supporting documentation," I said. "My attorney will respond." There was a pause. When Kayla spoke again, something had changed in her voice. The diplomatic surface had thinned. "You're doing this out of spite." "I'm doing this because I own 49% of a company that was used to hide marital assets in an account connected to your address," I said pleasantly. "Those are two different things." The silence that followed was very loud. "You should talk to Marcus," she said finally. "I agree. He should call Patricia Howe." She hung up. 2 days later, Marcus appeared at my door unannounced. He had lost weight. I noticed it immediately, the way a face sharpens when someone is under sustained stress. And his composure, always one of his better features, had developed visible cracks. He stood on the porch where we had sat together for 19 years of summer evenings, and he told me I was going to ruin him. "The business will collapse under a valuation process," he said. "You know that. The clients will panic. The contractors will—" "I've structured the request to minimize operational disruption," I said. "Robert Chen is experienced with ongoing businesses. It doesn't have to be chaotic." "You did this on purpose." "I did this correctly," I said. "Those are also different things." He told me I was being cruel. He told me about the baby, as if I'd forgotten, and about Kayla's anxiety and the pressure of the situation. He told me he'd make sure I was taken care of, that he'd give me the house, that we could settle this without destroying everything. "Patricia Howe," I said for the 4th time. "Call her." He grabbed my wrist, not violently, but firmly, in the way that assumed it would stop me from closing the door. "Diane, I am asking you, please." I looked down at his hand on my wrist. I looked up at him. "Take your hand off me," I said. He did. He stepped back. For a moment on the porch in the gray November afternoon, I saw something in his face that might have been the old Marcus, the one I'd loved, understanding what he had actually lost. Then it closed over and he walked back to his car. I went inside. I locked the door. And I took 3 days off. I went to a small inn in the Berkshires that I'd always meant to visit in the western Massachusetts hills, where the leaves were almost gone and the air was clean and cold. I walked every morning. I ate well. I slept without waking at 3 a.m. I did not check my email more than once a day. It was the best decision I made in those months, second only to calling Patricia Howe. I came back from the Berkshires on a Sunday evening, the car smelling of pine from a candle I'd bought at a small shop in Lenox, and I felt for the first time in months genuinely like myself. Not the self I'd been in the marriage, accommodating, background, the capable woman who kept the machinery running while someone else put his name on the door. The earlier self. The one who had built a practice from a second bedroom and a used desk, who had once sat across from a very difficult IRS auditor and won, who had learned early that the most useful thing in a negotiation is the ability to wait. Marcus was waiting, apparently, for me to soften. He sent an email the day after I returned, not to Patricia, directly to me, which Patricia had asked him not to do. The email was 2 pages. It began with apology, genuine sounding, detailed, referencing specific moments from our marriage with the kind of recalled particularity that is either true remorse or carefully deployed sentiment. It said he had made terrible mistakes. It said he was scared. It said that whatever happened with Kayla, he had loved me, and he didn't want to see the life we'd built destroyed in a courtroom. I read it twice. Then I forwarded it to Patricia with a single line. For the file. What I noticed, sitting in my kitchen on that Monday morning, was the absence of what I'd expected to feel. No surge of grief, no weakening. Not because I was hard. I'm not a hard person, and I don't want to be. But because I had done my grieving already in those first days after he left, and I had made my decisions, and the email was trying to reach a version of me that no longer existed in the same form. I had a life to construct. That was more interesting. The social dimension of divorce, I'd always thought, was underestimated. People focus on the legal machinery, the financial division, the anger, and those things are real. But there is also the strange experience of re-entering the world as a single person after 2 decades, of reconstructing your social identity without the shape of another person built around you. It was my friend Carol who helped most with this. Carol Bergstrom and I had been friends since Lily's school, when we'd served together on some interminable PTA committee and had discovered a shared appreciation for dry wine and frank conversation. She'd been divorced herself 8 years earlier, a clean, mutual uncoupling that she discussed without bitterness. She knew the geography. We had dinner at her kitchen table, not a restaurant, which felt like too much at the time, and I told her everything about Marcus, about Kayla, about the company and the Shell LLC and the forensic accountant and Patricia Howe. Carol listened in the way she always listened, without filling the silences unnecessarily. "What are you most afraid of?" she asked when I finished. I thought about it seriously. "That I will get through all of this," I said slowly, "and arrive at the other side and find that I don't know who I am without it." She looked at me for a moment. "You're the woman who just identified a fraudulent shell company in your husband's business records. I think you'll figure it out." I laughed, genuinely, for the first time in a long time. The laugh surprised me with its normalcy. Carol introduced me in the following weeks to her book group, which met on Thursday evenings at rotating houses and read with cheerful lack of system, jumping between literary novels and thrillers and the occasional celebrity memoir without apology. I started going. It was a small, real pleasure. Women in their 40s and 50s talking about books and lives with the unsentimental directness of people who had stopped performing uncomplicated happiness. I also returned to something I had let go years earlier. I started running again. Not ambitiously. 20 minutes in the morning, the neighborhood quiet and cold, the rhythm of it simple and clarifying. Marcus had always complained that my morning runs disrupted his sleep, an objection so small it hadn't seemed worth arguing about, and so had simply disappeared one day. Now there was no one to disturb. Marcus's attorney filed a motion challenging my membership interest in Crawford, citing lack of active participation. Patricia filed a 40-page response citing the operating agreement, the original LLC statute, and relevant Connecticut case law. The judge scheduled a hearing for January. I noticed that Kayla had gone quiet. No more phone calls. I assumed she and Marcus were conserving their strategy, consulting with Gerald Finch about how to contain the damage. Let them. I had Patricia and Robert and 19 years of paper records, and now, on Thursday evenings, a book group that made me feel, quietly, that the world was still large. They came together. I hadn't expected that. It was a Saturday in early December, one of those clear, cold days in Connecticut when the light is very bright and the shadows are precise, and everything has the quality of something about to end. I was in the garden. Not gardening, just walking along the frozen beds, making a mental list of what I'd replant in spring, when I heard the car in the driveway, Marcus's SUV, and behind it, a second car I didn't recognize, a leased sedan that I would later learn was Kayla's. I stood in the garden and watched them walk toward the front door together. They made, objectively, a striking couple. He was still handsome in his worn, tired way, and she was young and fair-haired and visibly pregnant now, wearing a camel coat that emphasized rather than concealed. She looked, I thought, nervous. He looked determined, which in Marcus usually meant he was frightened. I let them in because not letting them in would have given the moment a drama it didn't deserve. We sat in the living room I had furnished over 19 years, where Lily had learned to walk, where we had opened Christmas mornings. And Marcus began with the version of himself that I recognized as his negotiation voice, reasonable, measured, trying to position us as two rational adults solving a shared problem. We want to settle, he said, fairly, without dragging this into a public hearing. That's what I've wanted from the beginning, I said. Your attorney has Patricia's contact information. We wanted to come to you directly. He glanced at Kayla. She was sitting forward on the couch, her hands folded carefully in her lap. The business valuation is going to damage Crawford regardless of how it comes out. You know that. Clients get nervous. Suppliers start asking questions. If the company loses value through this process, we both lose. I'm aware of that, I said. Robert Chen is managing the process carefully. Robert Chen is going to take 6 months and cost $200,000 in fees and leave the company worth a third of what it is now. His voice had shifted, less reasonable now, the frustration showing through. Diane, be realistic. I am being realistic, I said. Realistic is why I hired him. Kayla spoke then. She had a voice that was carefully controlled, and I could tell she'd rehearsed this part. I know this situation isn't what you would have chosen, she said, and I'm not here to pretend it isn't painful, but Marcus and I have a child to think about, a baby who didn't choose any of this. She paused. If you take the company apart, that baby loses their father's livelihood. It was well done, I thought. The appeal to maternity, to the innocent child, to the part of me that had been a mother myself. She was not stupid, Kayla. I understand you're concerned about your child, I said. That's natural. I kept my voice even. But I want to make sure you understand something. The $340,000 that was routed through MCG Consulting to an account connected to your address, that came from a company I co-own. That money is a marital asset that was concealed from me. My interest in recovering it is not vindictive. It's mathematical. Something flickered in Kayla's face. Not guilt, exactly. More like surprise that I was willing to name the number so plainly in her presence. Marcus leaned forward. We can repay that. We can structure a settlement that conversation happens through our attorneys, I said. I stood up. I appreciate you coming in person. I'll let Patricia know you're ready to discuss settlement terms. Diane. Marcus's voice had dropped into something lower, older, the warning register I had learned to recognize after 19 years. If you push this to a hearing, I will make sure the court knows about your... He stopped. I waited. He was searching, I realized. Searching for something to use, some leverage, some counterweight, and finding the unpleasant truth that there wasn't one. My finances were clean. My professional history was clean. He had never had occasion to look for ammunition because he had never imagined he would need it. I'll see you out, I said. Kayla stood quickly. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite categorize. Anger, but also something underneath it that might have been a recognition that this was not going the way she had planned. They left. I watched their cars reverse out of the driveway from the living room window. My hands were trembling slightly, I noticed. Not from fear, but from the adrenaline of confrontation, which my body processed the same way regardless of outcome. I was afraid. I want to acknowledge that. Sitting alone in the quiet house in the December light, I was genuinely physically afraid of what they might yet do, what leverage they might find, whether Marcus's ominous unfinished threat had been bluster or something real. But here is what I had learned over these months. Fear and resolution are not opposites. They can occupy the same space. The fear sharpened me. It reminded me that the stakes were real and that I was not finished yet. I called Patricia on Monday. I told her what Marcus had said and not said. She added it to the file. The hearing was set for January 14th. Judge Elaine Morrow, Hartford Superior Court. Family court in January has a specific quality. The light is thin, the hallways smell of coffee and old paper, and everyone moves with the slightly subdued energy of people managing something they'd rather not have to manage. I wore gray. I am aware that clothing choices in courtrooms carry meaning, and I chose mine deliberately. Professional, calm, neither aggressive nor diminished. Patricia wore navy. We arrived 30 minutes early and went over the outline one final time in a conference room the size of a large closet. He'll try to argue functional non-participation, she said. Gerald will bring up the fact that you weren't present in day-to-day operations. I know. You'll be asked about your involvement in 2009, in the tax filing years, about the restructuring you did in 2013 when he almost lost the Bridgeport contract. I remember all of it. She looked at me over her glasses. I know you do. I'm not worried about you. The courtroom itself was smaller than courtrooms appear in film. Judge Morrow was a compact, precise woman in her late 50s, with silver hair and a manner that suggested she had heard a great deal of things and was prepared to hear more. Gerald Finch sat at the opposing table with Marcus beside him. Marcus was dressed well. He always dressed well. but there were shadows under his eyes and a tightness in his jaw that hadn't been there a year ago. Kayla was in the gallery. I registered her presence without looking directly at her. Gerald opened by arguing that my membership interest in Crawford was a nominal administrative formality, his phrase, that had never reflected genuine economic participation or managerial authority. He cited 4 years of tax returns on which my name appeared only peripherally. He argued that to grant equitable value for a 49% interest under these circumstances would constitute a windfall. Then Patricia presented Robert Chen. Robert was not a theatrical witness. That was his greatest strength in a setting like this. He spoke in the flat, precise language of numbers and documentation, and what he described, methodically with exhibits, was a company that I had helped finance in its early years through a personal loan of $85,000 from my own practice's line of credit, that I had helped restructure in 2013, that I had advised on its tax strategy for 10 years, and from which, over 4 years, $340,000 had been systematically redirected through a shell entity. Judge Morrow asked several questions during Robert's testimony. They were very specific questions about the LLC statute, about the Delaware registration of MCG Consulting, about the timing of the password changes on the shared financial software, 8 months before Marcus filed for divorce, 8 months before the petition that listed only the house and the investment accounts. Gerald cross-examined Robert with energy, but the numbers didn't move. Numbers rarely do. Then I was called. I had been in professional settings my entire adult life that required me to present complex information clearly under conditions of scrutiny. This was not so different. I explained my involvement in Crawford from the beginning. The conversations, the loan, the restructuring, the tax strategy. I spoke about the operating agreement and why it had been structured as it was. I answered Gerald's challenges directly, without evasion and without heat. At one point, Gerald asked me why, if I had a 49% ownership interest, I had never attended a single board meeting. Crawford Climate Solutions has never held a formal board meeting, I said. It's a member-managed LLC. There are no meetings on record because none were required under the operating agreement. You're welcome to review the company's meeting minutes. You'll find they don't exist. Judge Morrow wrote something down. Gerald tried once more. Wasn't it true that I had no involvement in daily operations, no client relationships, no vendor agreements? That's correct, I said. I was a co-owner, not an employee. The distinction matters. Marcus, at the opposing table, had gone very still. He had the look of a person who has watched a plan fail in real time and is still absorbing the extent of it. At one point, he leaned over to say something to Gerald, and Gerald put a hand briefly on his arm. A lawyer's gesture for not now. Kayla in the gallery had her hands folded in her lap. She looked smaller than she had in my living room. Judge Morrow took 2 days to deliberate. It is one of the particular qualities of legal proceedings that the crisis and the resolution are separated by ordinary time. You go home, you make dinner, you sleep or try to, and somewhere a judge reads documents and makes notes and applies the law to the specific human mess that has been placed before them. When her ruling came, it confirmed my 49% membership interest in Crawford Climate Solutions as a marital asset subject to equitable distribution. It ordered a full business valuation to establish fair market value. It noted in language that was professionally neutral but entirely clear that the transfers to MCG Consulting were of significant concern and would require further documentation before any final settlement could be reached. I sat in the courtroom and read the ruling with Patricia beside me and felt something I can only describe as clean. Not triumph. Triumph felt like the wrong word for something this serious. Just clean. The way a room feels after you've finally cleared out everything that didn't belong. The business valuation took 4 months. In those 4 months, several things happened in a sequence that, looking back, had the quality of inevitability, the kind that only seems inevitable once it's already occurred. First, 3 of Crawford's major clients, a commercial developer, a school district, and a hospital system that together accounted for nearly 40% of the company's revenue, learned through the standard process of conducting their own due diligence that Crawford was in the middle of contested legal proceedings that included allegations of financial irregularities. 2 of them quietly began the process of finding alternative HVAC providers. The school district sent a formal notice of non-renewal. Marcus had been right about one thing. The valuation process created uncertainty, and commercial clients dislike uncertainty. Second, the Delaware Attorney General's office, alerted by Judge Morrow's ruling and the documentation filed by Robert Chen, opened an inquiry into MCG Consulting. This was not, as I had told Patricia, something I had sought, but it was a consequence, and consequences follow their own logic regardless of whether you intended them. Third, Kayla's father, who had recommended Gerald Finch and who had apparently been providing financial support to the young couple during the proceedings, met with Marcus and had a conversation about which I have only second-hand information. What I know is that after that conversation, Gerald Finch filed a motion requesting an accelerated settlement conference. The motion was granted. We met in April in a neutral conference room in a Farmington office building. Not a courtroom, but close enough in atmosphere. Marcus and Gerald on one side, Patricia and I on the other. Kayla was not present. I noticed that absence. She had been strategic about which rooms she entered. Robert's completed valuation placed Crawford Climate Solutions' fair market value at $3.1 million, somewhat reduced from what it might have been a year earlier, given the client losses, but still substantial. My 49% interest was $1.519 million. In addition, the fraudulent conveyance claim on the MCG transfers, $340,000, 4 years of systematic redirection, was addressed separately. Patricia had argued that the transfers represented a dissipation of marital assets. Gerald conceded the point in the end with the weariness of someone who had run out of useful counterarguments. The settlement we reached after 7 hours in that conference room was as follows. I received the house, valued at $940,000, with the existing mortgage, which was small to be paid from Marcus's share of other assets. I received full buyout of my 49% in Crawford, structured as a 5-year payment plan secured against the business, with the first payment due immediately. I received a proportionate share of the retirement accounts and the investment portfolio, and I received a formal legal release from any further connection to Crawford Climate Solutions or any of its liabilities, which, given what was beginning to emerge about MCG, struck me as perhaps the most valuable element of the agreement. Marcus signed. He looked, sitting across that table, like someone who had been traveling in difficult weather for a very long time. Not broken, I don't use that word lightly, but profoundly tired. When Gerald slid the signature page across and Marcus picked up the pen, he looked up at me once. I met his eyes. There was nothing useful to say. He signed. I signed. Patricia and Gerald signed as witnesses. I drove home through April rain that blurred the Connecticut countryside into something impressionistic and soft. I stopped at a gas station in Wethersfield and bought a very bad cup of coffee and sat in the parking lot drinking it and looking out at the rain-gray road. I had owned this outcome for years before I knew I would need it. I had kept the paper records. I had understood the structure. I had done my work carefully and without acknowledgement, not strategically, simply because careful and thorough was how I did things. And when the moment arrived and the structure I had built through diligent habit turned out to be exactly the architecture I needed, I had been ready. I finished the coffee. I drove home through the rain to the house on Maple Creek Drive, mine. Spring in Connecticut, when it finally arrives after months of grudging gray, is almost embarrassingly beautiful. The magnolias along Maple Creek Drive came out in the first week of April, then the dogwoods, then my own garden, which I attacked with considerable energy that year, replanting the south beds, finally putting in the kitchen herb garden I'd talked about for a decade, building up from the cold ground something that was unmistakably mine. I repainted the living room, not dramatically, a warmer shade of the same neutral, something with more gold in it. I moved the furniture the way I had always wanted it, and Marcus had vetoed. Small changes, each one felt surprisingly significant. My practice had continued through all of it. Clients don't stop needing their taxes filed because your marriage is dissolving. And in fact, the focus of work had been a useful anchor during the worst months. By that spring, I had added 2 new clients who had come through referrals, including a small tech startup that was interesting and complicated in ways I enjoyed. I began to think about expanding the practice, hiring someone part-time, growing in the modest and concrete way that had always felt more real to me than anything ambitious or performative. Lily came to visit in May. She spent a long weekend and we walked the neighborhood in the late spring evenings, talking in the easy way we'd managed to maintain throughout the hardest period. She'd been careful with me, appropriately, not excessively, and I had been honest with her without making the situation feel like something she needed to manage on my behalf. We planted tomatoes in the garden on Saturday morning, in the good spring dirt, and she laughed at something I said, and I looked at her face in the May light and felt with a directness that was almost startling that I was fortunate. Carol's book group continued on Thursday evenings. I ran most mornings. I discovered in June that the small inn in the Berkshires offered a week-long fall retreat that I had every intention of attending. I did not look for a relationship. That was not, I told myself honestly, because I was opposed to one or because the marriage had destroyed my interest in connection. It was because I was genuinely engaged with the life I was rebuilding, and that engagement felt sufficient for now, and I had learned, in 2 years of managed crisis, the virtue of patience. Marcus, I knew through the small, unavoidable channels of a shared town and shared history, was having a difficult year. Crawford Climate Solutions had stabilized somewhat. He'd brought in a business partner, a man named Stein from Bridgeport, who had some capital and had helped slow the client attrition. But the Delaware inquiry into MCG Consulting had expanded, and in August I heard through Patricia, who received occasional professional updates in the event anything affected my settlement payments, that the inquiry had been referred to the IRS. Tax matters involving 4 years of misdirected payments and a shell LLC are not resolved quickly or cheaply. Kayla had the baby, a boy, I was told, in April. I noted this without feeling much about it one way or another. A child is a child. What I heard later from Carol, who heard from the network of women who maintain the informal social record of every suburb, was that the relationship between Marcus and Kayla had become strained. The pregnancy had been navigated under the pressure of the investigation and the financial settlement. the reality of a newborn and a business in partial crisis and legal fees that were, by any estimate, substantial. That combination had apparently revealed incompatibilities that the excitement of a new relationship had obscured. Kayla, I heard, had gone back to work sooner than planned. Her own family had pulled back their financial support after Marcus's legal situation became clearer. She had been, I gathered, under the impression that she was inheriting something solvent and substantial, and the gap between that impression and the reality was proving difficult. I felt no satisfaction in this. That is the honest truth, and I've examined it to make sure. What I felt was something more neutral, a recognition that the world has a way of clarifying itself over time, that decisions have consequences that extend further and cost more than they appear to at the moment of making them. Marcus made his first settlement payment on schedule in May, and in June, and in July. Then in September, Patricia received a request from Gerald Finch. Gerald still, though presumably at reduced rate, asking if I would consider deferring the October payment for 60 days given Crawford's cash flow challenges. Patricia called to ask my preference. No, I said. The October payment arrived on the scheduled date. I put it toward the mortgage. Standing in my kitchen in October, with the autumn garden visible through the window and a cup of tea that I actually remembered to drink while it was still warm, I did the math on what I had. The house, the practice, the payment plan, the investment accounts, the retirement savings, and I felt something that it took me a moment to name correctly. It was security. Real security, not the version I'd had before, which had rested on someone else's continuity and goodwill. This kind was built from my own choices, my own work, my own stubborn habit of keeping the paper records. I stood in my kitchen for a while, doing nothing in particular, and then I went out to the garden in the October afternoon and planted a row of bulbs for spring. I plant bulbs every fall. You put something in the ground in the cold, and in spring it comes back. Looking back, what I want you to understand is this. I did not win because I was clever or lucky, or because the law happened to favor me. I won because I paid attention for 19 years, because I kept every document, because I knew what I had built and I did not pretend otherwise when the moment came to say so. The most dangerous assumption a person can make is that competence without visibility is the same as worthlessness. Marcus made that assumption. It cost him enormously. If someone ever tells you that you are too old, too quiet, too background to matter, look carefully at what you know, what you've kept, what you've built without asking for credit. That knowledge is not nothing. It may be everything. Now I want to ask you something, and I mean it seriously. What would you have done? Would you have signed those papers and walked away? Or would you have opened the filing cabinet? If this story stayed with you, if some part of it felt familiar, I hope you'll leave a comment. I read everyone. And thank you for listening all the way to the end. That matters more than you know.